The carriage wheels ground against the gravel drive as Ravenscroft Hall emerged from the autumn mist like a spectre rising from troubled dreams, its grey stone towers catching the last amber light of October 14th, 1814, and Eleanor Ashworth pressed her gloved hand against the cold window glass, watching the edifice grow larger with each turn of the wheel, feeling something between dread and a strange, unbidden anticipation settle into her bones. She had heard the whispers, of course, during the 3 weeks since Lady Pembroke had accepted this invitation, whispers about the Duke who had retreated from society after his riding accident 18 months prior, whispers about his bitterness, his refusal to receive visitors, his transformation from one of London's most eligible gentlemen into a recluse who preferred darkness to the pitying gazes of the world. Lady Pembroke stirred beside her, adjusting her position to ease the rheumatism in her hip, and Eleanor instinctively reached to steady the elderly widow's cane before it could slip to the carriage floor. That was her purpose, after all, had been her purpose for 6 years now, to anticipate needs, to smooth difficulties, to exist in the margins of other people's lives, while her own remained a page largely unwritten. At 27, she had long since accepted the verdict society had rendered upon her, plain-featured, dowerless, useful only in her capacity to serve. And she had learned to find what contentment she could in small mercies, in the warmth of a fire on a cold evening, in the particular satisfaction of a well-turned phrase in a book, in the knowledge that Lady Pembroke, at least, valued her steady presence, if not her person. The coachman called out as they rounded the final curve, and Eleanor caught her breath at the full grandeur of the hall before them, its windows glinting like watchful eyes, its gardens browning with the season, golden leaves scattered across the lawn like discarded invitations to some long-past celebration. A footman emerged to hand them down, and as Eleanor descended, she heard 2 housemaids speaking near the entrance, their words carrying clearly in the still air. "Poor creature," one murmured, glancing at Eleanor's grey travelling dress with its sensible cut and unfashionable silhouette. Another spinster companion. What a dreary existence. The other maid hushed her companion as Lady Pembroke approached, but Eleanor had heard, as she always heard, and she tucked the small wound away with all the others, a collection she had long since stopped counting. Inside, the housekeeper Mrs. Fleming showed them to their chambers, and later, as dusk gave way to evening and Lady Pembroke complained of the journey's toll upon her nerves, Eleanor took up the book they had been reading, a volume of poetry, and began to recite aloud, her voice filling the shadowed room with its particular richness, that singular gift she possessed, which seemed so incongruous with her unremarkable face. Lady Pembroke sighed with pleasure, closing her eyes, and somewhere in the great house above them, in rooms Eleanor could not yet imagine, a blind duke sat alone in darkness, not knowing that the voice which would change everything had just arrived within his walls. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The morning of October 15th, 1814, brought with it a grey drizzle that seemed to seep into the very stones of Ravenscroft Hall, and Eleanor found herself navigating the unfamiliar corridors with the particular caution of one who knows her place exists only in the margins, fetching Lady Pembroke's shawl from their chambers, delivering a note to the housekeeper, performing the small, invisible tasks that justified her presence among her betters. The other guests had arrived the previous evening, while Eleanor attended to Lady Pembroke's comfort, and now she observed them from her careful distance. Lady Diana Montague with her sharp eyes and sharper tongue, and her daughter Lady Cassandra, whose beauty seemed almost architectural in its perfection. Golden curls arranged with artful precision, complexion like fresh cream, figure draped in pink silk that whispered expense with every movement. It was Cassandra who first acknowledged Eleanor's existence, though acknowledgment perhaps granted too much weight to the dismissive glance that swept over Eleanor's grey dress before settling somewhere past her left shoulder, as if Eleanor were a piece of furniture one noted only to avoid collision. The servants proved more forthcoming with information, and from Mrs. Fleming, who showed a particular kindness to those she deemed worthy of it, Eleanor learned fragments of the Duke's story. How Frederick Sinclair had been riding to hounds when his horse had thrown him against a stone wall, how he had lain unconscious for 3 days while the finest physicians in England could do nothing but wait, how he had awakened to permanent darkness, and a grief so profound it had transformed him from a man who had loved society into one who could not bear even his closest friend's presence. At dinner, which the Duke did not attend despite Cassandra's loudly expressed hope that he might, Eleanor heard more whispers, these directed at herself, Lady Diana murmuring to her daughter about the peculiar institution of the companion, how sad to reach such an age without prospects, how fortunate that some women possessed enough sense to make themselves useful when nature had not seen fit to make them beautiful. Eleanor ate in silence, as was proper, and afterward, when Lady Pembroke had been settled for the evening with her Tyson and her complaints about the dampness, Eleanor found herself wandering the great house in search of something she could not name. The library revealed itself at the end of the east corridor, and when she pushed open the heavy oak doors, she felt her breath catch at the magnificence before her, shelves rising to the ceiling, leather-bound volumes arranged with obvious care, 2 great chairs positioned before a fireplace where no fire currently burned, and everywhere the scent of paper and ink and the particular mustiness of knowledge long accumulated. She moved among the shelves with reverent fingers, noting titles in Latin and Greek alongside English, novels and philosophy and poetry, and when she found a volume of verse, she could not resist speaking a few lines aloud, testing the acoustics of this sacred space, hearing her own voice return to her from the high ceiling like an old friend she had not known she was missing. The rain intensified against the windows, and Eleanor stood alone among the books, not knowing that this room would become the axis upon which her entire existence would turn. The night of October 17th, 1814, found Eleanor unable to sleep, her mind restless with thoughts she could not quiet, and so she rose from her bed some time past midnight, wrapped her worn shawl over her nightclothes, and took up the single candle that burned low on her bedside table-lamp, its flame casting shadows that danced like uncertain spirits as she made her way through the darkened corridors of Ravenscroft Hall toward the library that had captured her imagination 2 days prior. The rain that had begun on her first full day at the estate continued its relentless assault against the windows, and Eleanor found comfort in the sound, in the way it made the great house feel smaller somehow, more intimate, as if the storm had drawn walls closer together and created a world apart from the one where she was airly a spinster companion, unworthy of notice. The library door yielded silently to her touch, and she slipped inside, breathing in the scent of leather and old paper. Feeling her shoulders release tension she had not known she carried as she moved toward the shelves where she had discovered the poetry volumes during her previous visit. Her candle provided barely enough light to read the spines, but she found what she sought, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets bound in burgundy leather, and she settled into one of the great chairs before the cold fireplace, tucking her feet beneath her, opening the book to a page at random. She began to read aloud, softly at first, then with growing confidence as the familiar words wrapped around her like a blanket, her voice filling the empty space with its particular richness, that gift which seemed so strange a possession for a woman whom nature had otherwise forgotten to favor. She did not know how long she read, losing herself in the verses, speaking them as if they were her own thoughts given form, until a voice emerged from the darkness beyond her candle's reach, deep and slightly rough, saying simply, "Do not stop." Eleanor's heart seized in her chest as she stumbled to her feet, the book tumbling from her lap, her candle flame guttering dangerously with the sudden movement, and she strained to see into the shadows from which the voice had come, making out only the vague shape of a figure seated in the chair opposite hers, a chair she had believed empty. "I did not mean to frighten you," the voice continued, and now she could hear something beneath the cultured tones, a weariness perhaps, or a loneliness that echoed her own, and she knew with sudden certainty that she stood in the presence of the Duke of Ravenscroft himself, the blind master of this house who preferred darkness to the world's pity. "Your Grace," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. "I beg your pardon. I did not know anyone was here. I should not have intruded." But even as she spoke, she found she could not move toward the door, could not flee as propriety demanded, held in place by something she could not name, as Frederick Sinclair leaned forward into the faint reach of her candle's light, revealing clouded eyes that saw nothing, and a face marked by suffering, yet somehow still compelling, and said with an urgency that surprised them both, "Please, I have not heard anyone read like that in 18 months. Stay and read to me." Eleanor retrieved the fallen book with trembling fingers, acutely aware of the Duke's presence in the darkness beyond her meagre candle's reach, and she found herself unable to form the polite excuses that would permit her escape, instead sinking back into the chair as if her legs had simply refused to carry her away from this strange and terrifying intimacy that had sprung up between two strangers in the deep hours of the night. "You were reading Sonnet 29, Frederick said, and his voice carried that same roughness she had noted before, as if it had gone too long unused when in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes. And Eleanor nodded before remembering he could not see her assent, then whispered, "Yes, Your Grace, though I did not mean to disturb your solitude." He made a sound that might have been a laugh had it contained any warmth, and replied that his solitude had become a prison. He no longer knew how to escape. That the darkness which had been thrust upon him had grown familiar as an old coat, comfortable in its misery, and that her voice had been the first thing in 18 months to make him wish to hear anything at all beyond the relentless silence of his own thoughts. Eleanor turned the pages until she found her place, and she began to read again, her voice steadier now as the words of Shakespeare filled the space between them, speaking of disgrace and outcast state and troubling deaf heaven with bootless cries, and she felt the poet's despair resonate with something deep within her own chest, that knowledge of what it meant to be overlooked, to be deemed worthless by a world that measured value in coin and beauty and circumstance. When she finished the sonnet, Frederick asked her to continue, and so she did, moving through verses of love and loss and longing, occasionally pausing when he interjected a comment or question that revealed a mind still sharp despite his suffering, a wit that emerged in bitter flashes like lightning through storm clouds, and she found herself responding with her own observations, her own interpretations, engaging in the kind of intellectual discourse she had not enjoyed since her father's death had stripped away both her fortune and her place in polite society. The rain intensified outside, thunder rolling across the moors surrounding Ravenscroft Hall, and neither of them moved to acknowledge the hour growing later or the impropriety of their situation. Two strangers alone in darkness, speaking of matters that somehow felt more honest than any conversation Eleanor had participated in during her 7 years of service to Lady Pembroke. He asked her name, and she hesitated, then said only that names were such limiting things. Were they not that they came weighted with expectations and assumptions, and in the darknesses, perhaps they might simply be two voices finding comfort in shared words? Frederick was silent for a long moment, then laughed, genuinely this time, the sound rusty but real, and said she was either very wise or very mysterious, and he found he did not mind which. When the clock somewhere in the house chimed 4, Eleanor rose and said she must go before the household stirred, and he asked if she would return the following night, and she knew she should refuse, knew that nothing good could come of this strange connection forged in shadow, but she heard herself say yes, and then she slipped away through the servant corridor she had memorized, carrying her guttering candle and the echo of his rare laughter like treasures held close against her heart. Eleanor woke on the morning of October 18th, 1814, with barely 3 hours of sleep behind her, and the echo of Frederick's laughter still warming some hidden chamber of her heart. And she moved through the rituals of dressing and attending Lady Pembroke as if in a dream, her fingers clumsy with buttons, her mind wandering back to the library and the darkness and the voice that had found something worthy in her own. Yet she forced herself to perform her role with the invisibility she had perfected over 7 years of service, answering when spoken to in the briefest possible phrases, keeping her remarkable voice subdued to its most unremarkable register as she helped Lady Pembroke navigate the breakfast room where the other guests had already gathered. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the grounds of Ravenscroft Hall muddy and strewn with golden leaves torn from their branches, and pale autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows as Eleanor took her customary seat at the far end of the table, removed from the conversation of her betters, invisible as the servants who moved silently along the walls. Lady Cassandra Montague held court at the centre of the table, resplendent in pink silk that caught the morning light like rose petals touched with dew, her golden curls arranged in artful cascades, her laughter ringing out with practiced musicality as she entertained the assembled guests with observations about London society, and Eleanor watched her with the resigned appreciation one might offer a painting, acknowledging beauty while knowing it existed in a world entirely separate from one's own. It was near the end of the meal when the murmuring began, a ripple of surprise passing through the guests as the dining-room doors opened and Frederick Sinclair, Duke of Ravenscroft, entered the room for the first time since his guests had arrived, his tall frame moving with careful precision, one hand trailing along the wall he had memorized, his clouded eyes fixed on nothing as Mrs. Fleming guided him to his place at the head of the table. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as she saw him in daylight for the first time, saw the dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead, the strong jaw shadowed with mourning stubble, the scar near his left temple where the accident had left its mark, and she understood why Lady Cassandra had pursued him so relentlessly, for even diminished by tragedy he was striking, commanding, a man whose presence filled the room despite his inability to see it. She watched as Cassandra immediately redirected her attention toward the Duke, her voice rising in honeyed greeting, and Eleanor shrank further into her invisibility, knowing that Frederick was listening, searching among the voices for the one he had heard in darkness, and she pressed her lips together, terrified that a single word might betray her. Lady Pembroke, dear kind Lady Pembroke, turned to Eleanor and said warmly, "Perhaps you might read to us after luncheon, Miss Ashworth, for you have such a gift for it." And Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as Frederick's head turned sharply toward their end of the table, his clouded eyes seeming to search the air for something he could not find, and she whispered only that she had developed a headache and begged to be excused, fleeing the room before her voice could condemn her to discovery. The night of October 20th, 1814 found Eleanor slipping through the servant corridor for the 3rd time, her heart beating with an anticipation she no longer tried to deny. And when she entered the library, she found Frederick already waiting in his accustomed chair, his face turned toward the door as if he had been listening for her footsteps, and something in his expression shifted when he heard her enter. A softening around his mouth that made her chest ache with feelings she had no right to possess. The storm had finally broken that afternoon, and now moonlight streamed through the tall windows, silvering the spines of countless books and casting pale shadows across the Persian carpet, where Eleanor settled into her own chair, closer to his than propriety would ever permit in daylight. Close enough that when she opened the novel, they had begun together 2 nights prior, her arm nearly brushed against his. They had abandoned Shakespeare for a Gothic romance that Frederick claimed to find ridiculous, but which made him laugh in all the right places. And Eleanor read now with an ease she had never known before, her voice rising and falling with the drama of the tale, occasionally pausing to offer her own observations or to hear his sardonic commentary on the heroine's questionable decisions. It was during one such pause that Frederick said quietly, "I find myself preferring the darkness now." And when Eleanor asked what he meant, he explained that in darkness there was no pity, no carefully averted gaze, no false cheer masking discomfort, only voices revealing what people truly thought and felt. And Eleanor understood him perfectly, because she had spent 7 years reading the truth behind pleasant words, hearing contempt dressed as courtesy, dismissal wrapped in politeness. She told him that voices were honest in ways faces never could be, that she had learned to trust the tremor beneath confident words, the warmth or coldness that no amount of social training could fully disguise. And Frederick leaned toward her voice like a flower-seeking sun and said that hers was the only beautiful thing left in his world, the only thing that made him forget, even briefly, that he was broken. Eleanor's breath caught at his words, at the raw honesty of them, and she wanted to tell him that he was not broken, that his mind blazed with wit and intelligence, that his company had become the single bright point in days otherwise filled with invisibility and insignificance. But instead she simply continued reading, letting the story speak what she could not. When she reached for the book she had set aside, his hand moved at the same moment, and their fingers brushed against the leather binding, and neither of them pulled away. The touch was electric, terrifying, wonderful. His skin warm against hers for just a moment before she withdrew to turn the page, but she felt him smile in the darkness, felt the shift in the air between them, and she knew that whatever this was, it had already grown beyond her ability to control or contain it. The afternoon of October 22nd, 1814, brought the first true frost to Ravenscroft Hall, and Eleanor watched from the morning-room window as delicate crystals of ice traced patterns across the glass, her breath clouding the pane as she observed Lady Cassandra Montague strolling the frozen gardens in a cream gown trimmed with gold that caught the weak autumn sunlight, like something spun from treasure. And Eleanor looked down at her own best dress, the dark blue wool that had seemed almost pretty when she had packed it in London, but which now felt as drab as her prospects. And she wondered how she had ever imagined that anything beautiful could grow from her secret meetings with Frederick when women like Cassandra existed in the same world. At dinner that evening, Frederick appeared again, the second time that week, and Eleanor noticed how the other guests remarked upon his improved spirits, how Mrs. Fleming smiled with genuine warmth as she watched her master engage in conversation, and Eleanor felt a fierce pride that she had no right to claim, knowing that those midnight hours of reading and laughter had drawn him back from whatever dark place he had retreated to after his accident. Yet she also felt a creeping dread as she watched Cassandra angle her chair closer to the Duke and deploy every weapon in her considerable arsenal, her musical laugh ringing out at his driest observations, her hand finding reasons to brush against his arm, her voice dropping to intimate murmurs that Eleanor could not hear from her distant position at the table. Frederick responded politely but distractedly, his clouded eyes turning occasionally toward the far end of the table, where Eleanor sat in silence beside Lady Pembroke. And she knew he was listening for her voice among the others, searching for the woman who existed only in darkness. And she pressed her lips together so tightly they ached, terrified that a single word might betray her secret to the sharp ears of Lady Cassandra, who had already begun watching Eleanor with a speculative gleam that made her stomach clench with anxiety. After dinner, Fleming drew Eleanor aside in the corridor and whispered urgently that Lady Cassandra had been asking the servants about unusual activity in the library, that she had overheard the footman mention someone using the room late at night, and the housekeeper's kind, weathered face was creased with worry as she warned Eleanor to be careful, to consider whether whatever was happening was worth the risk of discovery. Eleanor thanked her and retreated to her room, where she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and told herself she would not go to the library tonight, that she would end this before it destroyed her, that she had survived 27 years of invisibility and could survive many more. But when the clock struck midnight, she found herself reaching for her shawl, found her feet carrying her through the servant corridor she had memorized, found her heart racing as she pushed open the library door and saw Frederick's face turn toward her with an expression of such relief and joy that she knew she was lost, completely and irrevocably lost. The night of October 24th, 1814, brought a bitter frost that painted the windows of Ravenscroft Hall with delicate crystals of ice, and Eleanor found Frederick already seated in the library when she arrived, his face turned toward the window, as if he could somehow feel the cold seeping through the glass. And when she settled into her chair beside him, he reached out without hesitation and found her hand, lacing his fingers through hers with a certainty that made her heart stutter and race. And for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the crackling of the low fire and the occasional settling of the ancient house around them. They had nearly finished the Gothic novel that had made them both laugh and groan at its excesses. But tonight, Frederick showed no interest in reading, and when Eleanor reached for the book, he stopped her with a gentle pressure on her fingers and said in a voice roughened by something she could not name that he needed to know who she was, not her name or her station, but who she truly was, what she looked like, whether her eyes were dark or light, whether her hair curled or fell straight, whether she was tall or small, young or old, and Eleanor felt her throat tighten with the familiar terror of exposure as she asked him quietly why it mattered when he had said himself that voices revealed more truth than faces ever could. Frederick turned toward her then, his clouded eyes searching in her direction with an intensity that made her feel he could somehow see through the darkness that imprisoned him. And he said that it mattered because he was falling in love with her voice and her wit and her intelligence and her kindness, with the way she laughed at his bitter jokes and challenged his self-pity and made him feel like a man rather than a broken thing to be pitied. And he needed to know everything about her because he intended to ask her to be his wife. Eleanor's breath left her in a rush that was almost a sob, and she wanted so desperately to believe him, to trust that his words would remain true when he learned that she was plain-featured and past her youth and penniless and nobody. But 27 years of being overlooked and dismissed had taught her that men did not choose women like her, that whatever magic existed in this darkened library would dissolve like morning mist when exposed to daylight. And so she asked him with a tremor in her voice whether he would feel the same if he could see her, if he knew that she was not beautiful, not young, not anything that society valued in a woman. Frederick lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles that burned through her skin and into her very bones, and he told her that he had spent 32 years surrounded by beautiful faces and had found nothing but emptiness behind most of them, that her voice had saved him from despair, and that he would love her if she were plain as a sparrow or scarred as he was, and Eleanor let herself believe him for one precious moment. Clutching his words to her heart like a talisman against the revelation she knew must eventually come. The morning of October 26, 1814, brought Dr. Samuel Whitmore to Ravenscroft Hall, his carriage arriving just as the weak autumn sun reached its zenith, and Eleanor watched from the window of Lady Pembroke's sitting room as the elderly physician descended with his worn leather bag, his white hair catching the light as he straightened his stooped shoulders and made his way toward the great doors with the measured tread of a man who had walked these halls many times before. And she felt her heart clench with an anxiety she could not name, as she realized that this visit might change everything she had come to treasure in the darkness of the library. Lady Pembroke remarked that Dr. Whitmore had been treating the Duke since the accident 18 months ago, that he was a kind man and skilled in his profession, and Eleanor nodded mechanically while her mind raced with questions she dared not voice, wondering what news the doctor might bring, and whether she should hope for Frederick's healing or fear it with equal measure. The examination took place in Frederick's private chambers, and the household seemed to hold its breath as the hours stretched past, servants moving quietly and guests speaking in hushed tones as if illness rather than injury held their host captive, and Eleanor found herself unable to concentrate on the mending in her lap, her needle piercing the fabric at odd angles until Lady Pembroke gently took it from her hands and suggested she take some air in the gardens. That evening, the news spread through the drawing-room like wildfire, carried on whispers and meaningful glances until even Eleanor, in her invisible corner, heard that Dr. Whitmore had consulted with a specialist in London, that there was a new treatment involving specific regimens of herbal compress and gradual light exposure, that there was hope, real hope, that the Duke might regain some or even all of his sight within 6 weeks if he agreed to undertake the procedure. And Eleanor felt the floor shift beneath her feet as the implications crashed over her like a wave of icy water. That night in the library, Frederick's voice was rough with emotions he struggled to contain as he told her what the doctor had proposed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as he confessed that he had long ago resigned himself to darkness and did not know whether he could bear to hope again, only to be disappointed. And Eleanor listened with her heart breaking in her chest, because she knew she should encourage him, knew that wanting him to remain blind so that he might never see her plainness was the most selfish wish she had ever harbored. And so she took his hand in hers and told him, with a voice that trembled only slightly, that he must try, that he deserved to see the autumn leaves and the faces of those who loved him, and all the beauty that the world still held. And when he asked her why she sounded so sad, she lied and said she was merely tired, and later in her narrow bed she wept into her pillow while Lady Pembroke pretended not to hear them. The afternoon of October 28th, 1814, dawned grey and bitter, with a cold rain lashing against the windows of Ravenscroft Hall as if the sky itself wept in anticipation of what was to come. And Eleanor sat in her customary corner of the drawing-room, her grey dress rendering her nearly invisible against the faded upholstery, while Lady Pembroke dozed beside the fire and the other guests gathered in clusters of silk and laughter, and she did not see Lady Cassandra Montague approaching until the woman's emerald gown filled her vision like a poisonous bloom, and Cassandra's voice rang out with deliberate clarity that silenced every conversation in the room as she declared that she had solved the mystery that had been plaguing them all, that she knew who had been meeting the Duke in the library each night, like some common trollop sneaking to an assignation, and Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as every eye in the room turned toward her corner with expressions ranging from curiosity to gleeful malice. Cassandra continued with honeyed venom that it was none other than Miss Ashworth, Lady Pembroke's spinster companion, the plain little nobody who read aloud so prettily. And was it not delicious that the blind Duke had been courting a woman he would never choose if he could see her mousy hair and unremarkable features, and the lines already forming around her eyes? and the laughter that rippled through the room cut Eleanor like shattered glass as she rose on trembling legs, her hands clenched at her sides while she searched for Frederick among the assembled guests and found him standing in the doorway, his clouded eyes turned toward the commotion, his face utterly still and unreadable as Cassandra's words reached his ears. Eleanor waited for him to speak, to deny it, to say something, anything, but his silence stretched like a chasm between them, and she could not bear to hear him confirm what she had always known, that she was not worthy, that he would be ashamed to have his name linked with hers. And so she fled, pushing past the whispers and the stares and the cruel smiles, her feet carrying her through corridors she barely saw until she reached her small chamber and locked the door behind her, pressing her back against the wood as sobs tore through her chest. Hours passed in that cold room while the rain continued its assault and the light faded from grey to black, and Eleanor had nearly convinced herself that she must pack her things and leave before dawn when she heard footsteps in the corridor, uneven and accompanied by the tap of a cane. And then Frederick's voice came through the door, rough with emotion as he said her name, her real name, Eleanor, and begged her to open the door, and when she finally did, he stood before her with rain still glistening in his dark hair, having navigated the unfamiliar path from the drawing-room to the servants' wing by asking directions from every maid he encountered, and he reached for her with hands that shook slightly as he told her that nothing had changed, that she was still the voice that had saved him from despair, the mind that challenged him, the soul he had chosen, and that he would shout it from the rooftops of London if she needed proof. The morning of October 30th, 1814, broke clear and cold over Ravenscroft Hall, the frost painting delicate patterns on the windows as Eleanor descended the stairs, with her heart hammering against her ribs, uncertain whether the events of 2 nights past had been real or merely the fevered imaginings of a woman too long starved for tenderness. But when she entered the breakfast room and found Frederick already seated at the head of the table, his clouded eyes turning toward the sound of her footsteps with an expression of such open warmth that several guests dropped their forks in astonishment, she knew that everything had indeed changed irrevocably. He rose from his chair and crossed the room toward her with the confident stride of a man who had memorized every obstacle, his hand extended until his fingers found her arm, and in a voice that carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room, he asked if she would do him the honor of accompanying him on a walk through the gardens, and Eleanor could only nod before remembering he could not see the gesture, and whispering yes with a voice that trembled despite her best efforts to steady it. Lady Cassandra's teacup clattered against its saucer as they departed, and Eleanor felt the weight of a dozen scandalized stares pressing against her back like physical blows. But Frederick's hand remained firm on her arm as he guided her through the great doors and into the crisp October air, the gardens spreading before them in shades of amber and gold beneath a pale autumn sky. They walked the gravel path in silence at first, their breath misting in the cold air, until Frederick stopped beside a stone bench overlooking the fountain and turned to face her with an expression of such gravity that Eleanor's newly kindled hope flickered and nearly died. But then he spoke in low tones meant only for her ears, telling her that he intended to call upon Lady Pembroke that very afternoon to formally request permission to court her, and when Eleanor began to protest that she was merely a companion, that society would never accept such a match, he silenced her objections by raising his hand to her face and asking with heartbreaking gentleness if she would permit him to see her in the only way remaining to him. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she took his hand and pressed it to her cheek, feeling his fingers trace the contours of her face with a reverence that made her breath catch in her throat, mapping the line of her jaw and the curve of her brow and the shape of her lips as if committing each feature to memory. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was rough with emotion as he declared that she was exactly as he had imagined, that her face fit perfectly in his palm, that he had found her beautiful from the first word she ever spoke, and nothing would ever convince him otherwise. From the windows of the drawing-room, Eleanor knew that Lady Cassandra and the other guests watched this intimate tableau unfold with expressions of shock and fury. But for the first time in her 27 years, she did not care what anyone thought, because Frederick Sinclair, Duke of Ravenscroft, had chosen her in the full light of day for all the world to witness, and the tears that slipped down her cheeks were caught by his gentle fingers as he smiled and called her his Eleanor at last. The days that followed October 30th unfolded like pages in a story Eleanor had never dared to imagine for herself, each morning bringing fresh evidence that Frederick's devotion had not wavered in the harsh light of day as she had feared. And by November 5th, 1814, a full week of courtship had transformed the atmosphere of Ravenscroft Hall from one of scandalized whispers to reluctant fascination as the remaining guests watched the blind Duke pursue his plain companion with a single-minded intensity that defied all social convention. The treatment Dr. Whitmore had proposed began on the 2nd of November, and now Frederick wore white linen bandages wrapped carefully around his eyes during the daylight hours, the fabric stark against his dark hair and adding an air of vulnerability to his already striking features that made Eleanor's heart ache with tenderness and terror in equal measure each time she looked upon him. They walked the frost-hardened paths of the garden each afternoon, Eleanor describing the bare branches silhouetted against pewter skies and the last stubborn leaves clinging to the oaks, while Frederick listened with his hand warm in hers and occasionally raised her fingers to his lips in gestures that made the watching servants exchange knowing glances. In the evenings, they continued their readings in the library. But the nature of their conversations had shifted from literary discussion to something far more intimate. And it was during one such evening, with fires blazing in every hearth against the November chill and early darkness pressing against the windows, that Eleanor finally found the courage to tell him of her family's fall from prosperity, of her father's gambling debts that had consumed their modest estate, of her mother's death from shame as much as illness, and of the 8 years she had spent in service to others while watching her youth slip away like sand through an hourglass. Frederick listened without interruption, his bandaged face turned toward her voice, and when she finished, he told her of his own loneliness, of how even when sighted he had felt unseen by those who cared only for his title and fortune, of the relief that had come with blindness because at least now he knew that those who remained did so for reasons beyond his wealth and position. They finished the novel they had begun together and started another, but increasingly the books lay forgotten as their conversations wandered into territories of hope and fear and tentative dreams. And on the evening of November 5th, as Eleanor read a passage about lovers separated by circumstance, Frederick reached out and stilled her hand upon the page and drew her toward him across the leather settee they now shared without pretense of propriety. The kiss, when it came, was tender beyond anything Eleanor had imagined, his lips finding hers with unerring accuracy despite his blindness. And she realized he had mapped her face so thoroughly in their garden walks that he knew exactly where she was in relation to him at every moment. And when they finally drew apart, breathless and trembling, he whispered against her hair that she was becoming his whole world. And Eleanor wept because she believed him and because she was terrified of the day his bandages would come off, and he would see at last what his hands and heart already knew. The evening of November the 10th, 1814, arrived with a stillness that seemed to hold its breath, the library fire burning low and casting dancing shadows across the walls as Eleanor settled into what had become her accustomed place on the leather settee, her dark blue dress smoothed carefully over her knees, while Frederick sat beside her with his bandaged eyes turned toward the warmth of the flames. And she could feel something different in the air tonight, a tension that hummed between them like a plucked string waiting to resolve into harmony or discord. and when he reached for her hand and held it between both of his own with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, she knew before he spoke that this night would change everything forever. Dr. Whitmore had visited that afternoon with news that the treatment was progressing better than expected, that in 3 weeks the bandages would come off, and Frederick would likely see again. And Eleanor had smiled and expressed joy, while her heart fractured into pieces behind her ribs, because 3 weeks meant the wedding she had begun to dream of would occur after his sight returned, after he could look upon her plain features and unremarkable form and realize the terrible mistake he had made in choosing her. Frederick turned toward her now and spoke her name with such tenderness that tears pricked at her eyes, and then he was reaching into his waistcoat pocket and withdrawing something that caught the firelight and blazed green and white like captured starlight. And Eleanor's breath stopped entirely as he pressed the ring into her palm and asked her in a voice rough with emotion if she would do him the honor of becoming his wife, his duchess, his partner in all things, for whatever years God granted them together. The emerald surrounded by diamonds was heavy in her hand, a Sinclair family heirloom that had graced the fingers of duchesses for 6 generations, and Eleanor wanted desperately to slide it onto her finger and say yes and believe that happiness was finally within her grasp. But instead, she heard herself asking the question that had haunted her for weeks, asking what would happen when his bandages came off, and he saw her at last, asking if he would regret binding himself to a woman whose face could never match the beauty of her voice. Frederick's expression shifted then, his jaw tightening with something that might have been frustration or might have been pain, and he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles before telling her that he had already seen her, that his fingers had memorized every line and curve of her face, that his heart had recognized her soul from the first word she ever spoke in this very room, and that if his eyes upon restoration showed him anything different from what he already knew to be true, then his eyes would simply be wrong, because Eleanor Ashworth was the most beautiful woman in England to him, and would remain so until his dying breath. She was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks as she whispered yes, and Frederick slid the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly before pulling her into an embrace so fierce and tender that Eleanor finally allowed herself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, she deserved to be loved after all. The morning of November 12th, 1814, dawned cold and bright, frost glittering on the windows of Ravenscroft Hall like scattered diamonds as Eleanor dressed in her dark blue gown with trembling fingers, the emerald ring heavy and unfamiliar on her hand, and by the time she descended to the breakfast room, the news had already spread through the household like wildfire, servants pausing in their duties to curtsy with knowing smiles and whispered congratulations that made Eleanor's cheeks flush with a mixture of pleasure and disbelief that this could truly be her life now. Frederick had insisted on making the formal announcement at breakfast, and Eleanor stood beside him as he addressed the assembled guests with a voice that rang with pride and defiance, declaring that Miss Eleanor Ashworth had done him the honor of accepting his hand in marriage, and that the wedding would take place in December at the chapel on the estate. And the silence that followed his words was deafening, broken only by the clatter of Lady Cassandra's teacup against its saucer as her face drained of all color and her mother pressed a hand to her chest, as though physically struck by the news. Lady Pembroke rose from her chair with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks and crossed the room to embrace Eleanor with a fierceness that surprised them both, whispering that she had always known Eleanor was destined for something far greater than fetching shawls and reading novels to an old woman. And then she turned to Frederick and told him he was getting the finest woman in England whether he knew it or not, and Frederick smiled and said he knew it better than anyone. The Montagues departed that very afternoon, their trunks loaded hastily onto their carriage, while Lady Cassandra stood in the entrance hall and delivered her parting words with venom dripping from every syllable, telling Eleanor that she hoped she enjoyed her brief triumph because society would never accept a spinster companion as a duchess, no matter how besotted her blind husband might be, and that when Frederick's sight returned, he would see exactly what sort of bride he had saddled himself with, and then Eleanor would understand what true humiliation felt like. Frederick stepped forward before Eleanor could respond, his bandaged face turning toward Cassandra with an expression of cold contempt, and he informed her that the only thing he would see when his sight returned was the woman he loved, and that Lady Cassandra's bitterness revealed far more about her own character than it could ever reveal about Eleanor's worth, and then he bid her a safe journey in a tone that made clear she would never be welcome at Ravenscroft again. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel drive as the Montagues departed, and Eleanor watched from the window with Frederick's arm around her waist, the emerald ring catching the pale November light. And for the first time since this impossible fairy tale had begun, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps happiness was not merely borrowed, but truly, permanently hers. The weeks that followed the Montagues' departure passed in a blur of wedding preparations and quiet happiness. November deepening into its coldest days as Eleanor found herself transformed from invisible companion to future Duchess of Ravenscroft, seamstresses arriving from London with bolts of ivory silk and delicate lace, while Mrs. Fleming bustled about the great house, directing servants in preparations that seemed to Eleanor like something from a dream she might wake from at any moment. Lady Pembroke had officially released Eleanor from her service with tears and embraces and promises to attend the wedding as an honoured guest rather than an employer, and Eleanor had wept too, as she thanked the woman who had shown her kindness during the loneliest years of her life, who had brought her to Ravenscroft Hall without knowing she was delivering Eleanor to her destiny. The remaining guests had departed one by one, some with genuine well-wishes and others with barely concealed astonishment that the blind Duke had chosen so poorly when he might have had any beauty in England. But Eleanor found that their opinions mattered less with each passing day as Frederick's steadfast devotion slowly wore away the armor she had built around her heart through 27 years of being overlooked and dismissed. They still met in the library each night, though now they sat openly together on the settee with her head resting against his shoulder as she read aloud, his bandaged eyes turned toward the fire, while his fingers traced absent patterns on her hand. And these quiet hours remained the most precious part of Eleanor's days, even as the wedding preparations swirled around them in an increasingly frantic dance. Whitmore visited twice weekly now to monitor Frederick's progress, reporting that the treatment was exceeding all expectations and that the bandages would come off on December 1st, just 2 weeks before the wedding date they had chosen. And each time Eleanor heard this news, she felt joy and terror warring within her chest because she wanted Frederick to see again more than she had ever wanted anything. Yet she could not silence the voice that whispered he would look upon her plain face and finally understand what everyone else had always known. Frederick sensed her fear, though she tried to hide it, and on the night of November 20th, he pulled her close in the fire-lit library and told her that he had loved her voice first, then her mind, then her heart, and that these were the things that mattered, that beauty faded and youth vanished, but the soul remained eternal, and that Eleanor's soul was the most beautiful thing he had ever encountered in 32 years of living. She wanted to believe him with every fiber of her being, and sometimes in the warmth of his arms she almost could. But then she would catch sight of her reflection in a darkened window and remember all the times she had been passed over, all the whispered cruelties, all the years of invisibility, and the doubt would creep back in like frost spreading across glass. beautiful in its way, but cold and relentless, and impossible to stop. December 1st, 1814 arrived with a pale winter sun that seemed to Eleanor both a blessing and a curse, the morning light streaming through the windows of Ravenscroft Hall as she sat in the small parlour adjacent to Frederick's chambers. Her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone white, the emerald ring pressing into her flesh as she listened to the low murmur of Dr. Whitmore's voice behind the closed door, and tried to remember how to breathe through the terror that had taken up residence in her chest. Mrs. Fleming had brought her tea that sat untouched and cooling on the table beside her, and Lady Pembroke had offered to wait with her, but Eleanor had declined, needing to face this moment alone, because it felt as though her entire life had been leading to this single point in time, when the man she loved would either see her and stay, or see her and understand at last what everyone else had always known. The door opened and Dr. Whitmore emerged, his elderly face creased with a smile that made Eleanor's heart stutter painfully. And he told her that the treatment had succeeded beyond his most optimistic hopes, that his Grace's vision was restored nearly in full, and that Frederick was asking for her with an urgency that bordered on desperation. Eleanor rose on legs that trembled beneath her skirts, smoothing the fabric of her dark blue dress with hands that shook visibly, and she thought of all the mirrors she had avoided in her 27 years, all the times she had looked away from her own reflection because she could not bear to see what others saw. And now she must walk through that door and offer herself up to the judgment she had spent a lifetime dreading. The room was dim when she entered, curtains still drawn against the bright winter light to protect Frederick's newly healed eyes, and she could see him sitting in a chair by the window, his bandages removed. His face turned toward the sound of her footsteps with an expression of such raw longing that it stole the breath from her lungs. He rose as she approached, and she watched his eyes focus on her for the first time, watched him take in her plain features, her unremarkable brown hair, the face that had inspired no poetry and launched no ships, and she braced herself for the moment when his expression would change from love to disappointment, from desire to polite resignation. But Frederick's eyes filled with tears that spilled down his scarred cheeks as he crossed the remaining distance between them and took her face in his hands with a reverence that made her sob, and his voice broke as he told her she was exactly as he had imagined, that she was perfect, that he had seen her truly from the very first moment she spoke in the darkness of the library, and now his eyes simply confirmed what his heart had always known. He wept with joy as he looked upon her, this man who could have had any beauty in England, and Eleanor finally understood that she had been seen all along, not despite her plainness but beyond it, into the depths of a soul that had always been worthy of love. The days following Frederick's restored sight passed in a golden haze of wonder and preparation, December arriving with snow that blanketed Ravenscroft Hall in pristine white as Eleanor walked through her new life, as though moving through a waking dream, still catching her breath each time Frederick looked at her with those healed eyes that held nothing but adoration and a joy so profound it made her chest ache with gratitude. He had taken to studying her face at every opportunity, memorizing the features he had first known only through touch, and Eleanor found that she no longer flinched from his gaze, but met it with growing confidence, because she had finally understood that what he saw when he looked at her was not the plain face that had inspired pity and dismissal for 27 years, but something far more precious, something she had never believed existed, until he showed her through the mirror of his love. The wedding preparations intensified as December 14th approached, the great house filled with flowers brought from hothouses in London, ivory silk being fitted to Eleanor's form by seamstresses who called her your grace in practice and made her blush each time. And through it all, Frederick remained by her side, his hand finding hers constantly, as though he still needed the reassurance of touch even now that sight had returned to him. Lady Pembroke arrived a week before the ceremony, tearful and proud and full of stories about how she had always known Eleanor was destined for greater things, conveniently forgetting the years of gentle resignation with which she had accepted Eleanor's spinsterhood. But Eleanor forgave her this revision of history because Lady Pembroke had brought her to Ravenscroft, and that single act of unknowing kindness had changed everything. Mrs. Fleming oversaw the household preparations with military precision, consulting Eleanor on every detail and treating her opinions with a deference that still felt foreign after so many years of being consulted on nothing more significant than which book to read aloud next. And Eleanor found herself growing into the role of Duchess with a natural grace that surprised everyone except Frederick, who had always known the depths that lay beneath her quiet exterior. The night before the wedding, they sat together in the library one final time as unmarried people, the fire burning low as Eleanor read aloud from the Shakespeare sonnets that had first brought them together. And when she finished, Frederick told her that he had spent 18 months in darkness believing he had lost everything worth living for, and that her voice had called him back from despair like a beacon guiding a ship through storm, and that tomorrow he would pledge his life to her, not because she had saved him, but because she had shown him that true sight had nothing to do with eyes and everything to do with recognizing the irreplaceable value of a soul that had waited far too long to be cherished. Eleanor closed the book and let herself be held, finally believing that she deserved this happiness, finally understanding that she had always been worthy of love, and that the world's blindness to her worth had been the true disability all along. The morning of December 14th, 1814, dawned crystalline and bright, winter sunlight streaming through the frost-laced windows of Ravenscroft Hall as Eleanor stood before the mirror in her chambers and allowed herself for the first time in her life to truly look at her own reflection without flinching, seeing not the plain features that had condemned her to invisibility, but the woman Frederick loved, the woman whose voice had called a broken man back from despair, and whose soul had proven worthy of a duke's devotion. The ivory silk of her wedding gown caught the light as she turned, the fabric whispering against her skin like a promise, and Mrs. Fleming dabbed at her eyes while fastening the delicate pearl buttons that traced Eleanor's spine, declaring that she had never seen a more beautiful bride, and meaning it with every fibre of her loyal heart. Lady Pembroke arrived with the veil, a confection of antique lace that had belonged to Frederick's mother, and as she settled it upon Eleanor's carefully arranged hair, she spoke of how proud she was, how she had always known Eleanor possessed depths that society was too blind to perceive, and Eleanor embraced her former employer with genuine affection, grateful for the twist of fate that had brought her to this house as a companion and would see her leave it as a duchess. The chapel at Ravenscroft had been transformed with hothouse roses and candles that flickered like earthbound stars, and Eleanor's hand trembled only slightly as she walked the ancient stone aisle toward the altar where Frederick waited, his restored eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that made her breath catch, his scarred face transformed by a joy so profound that several guests later swore they had never witnessed a bridegroom so obviously, devastatingly in love. He took her hands as she reached him, his fingers warm and steady around hers, and he whispered that she was radiant, that she had always been radiant, that he had simply been the first man granted the privilege of truly seeing her, and Eleanor felt the last vestiges of her old self, the invisible spinster who had believed herself unworthy of notice, dissolve like morning mist beneath the summer sun. The vows they exchanged were traditional in form, but revolutionary in meaning. Each promise weighted with the knowledge of how improbable this union was, How many obstacles they had overcome, how society had deemed them mismatched, and how gloriously wrong society had been. When Frederick kissed her to seal their marriage, Eleanor heard the assembled guests gasp at the passion evident in that embrace, and she understood that they were witnessing something rare, a love story that defied every rule the tongue held sacred. And she kissed her husband back with all the feeling she had suppressed for 27 years, finally free to want and be wanted, to love and be loved, to stand in the light without apology. The Duchess of Ravenscroft emerged from that chapel a woman transformed, not by silk or jewels or titles, but by the revolutionary act of being chosen by someone who had seen her true self and found it not merely acceptable, but irreplaceable. And as Frederick led her into their future, his hand warm in hers, and his healed eyes bright with tears of joy, Eleanor finally believed in her own worth. The wedding breakfast that followed the ceremony stretched through the afternoon, a magnificent affair that filled Ravenscroft Hall with music and laughter, and the clink of crystal raised in endless toasts to the Duke and his unlikely Duchess. And Eleanor sat beside Frederick at the head of the great table, her hand resting in his beneath the damask tablecloth, as she watched the faces of those who had once dismissed her as beneath notice, now offering congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity that she found she could identify with perfect accuracy, her years of invisibility having granted her the gift of reading people's true feelings beneath their polished social masks. Lady Pembroke wept openly throughout the meal, declaring to anyone who would listen that she had always known Eleanor was destined for greatness, that she had recognized from the very first day of their acquaintance that this quiet young woman possessed depths that society was too shallow to perceive, and Eleanor caught Frederick's knowing smile at these revisionist memories, but chose to accept the kindness behind them rather than challenge their accuracy. Mrs. Fleming had outdone herself with the feast, directing an army of servants who moved through the great hall with military precision, and Eleanor made a point of seeking out the housekeeper during a lull in the festivities to thank her personally, watching the older woman's eyes fill with tears as she embraced the new Duchess, and whispered that Ravenscroft had not known such happiness in longer than she could remember. The guests who remained, those who had stayed through the autumn weeks and witnessed the improbable love story unfold, seemed divided between genuine joy and barely concealed astonishment that a blind duke had chosen a plain spinster over the beautiful women who had paraded before him, and Eleanor found she no longer cared which category any particular guest fell into, because Frederick's devotion had finally convinced her that their opinions were irrelevant to her happiness. As evening approached and the candles were lit throughout the great hall, Frederick rose to address the assembled company, his healed eyes bright with emotion as he spoke of how darkness had taught him to truly see, how a voice in the night had called him back from despair, and how the woman beside him had shown him that beauty was never about faces or figures, but about souls brave enough to offer themselves honestly to another. And Eleanor felt tears streaming down her cheeks as the guests fell silent, even the skeptics moved by the raw sincerity in his words. He turned to her then, before all those watching eyes, and lifted her hand to his lips with a reverence that made her breath catch, declaring that he was the most fortunate man in England, that he would spend every day of his remaining life ensuring she understood her own worth, and that their story would be proof for all who witnessed it that love could flourish in the most unexpected gardens when two hearts were brave enough to recognize each other beyond the superficial judgments that society held so dear. And Eleanor rose to meet his embrace as the hall erupted in applause. The wedding night arrived wrapped in velvet darkness and the soft glow of candlelight. And as Frederick led Eleanor to the ducal chambers that had been prepared with fresh flowers and finest linens, she felt the last barriers between them dissolve into the intimacy they had built through weeks of whispered conversations and slowly deepening trust. And when he turned to her in the privacy of their room, his healed eyes held such reverence that she finally understood he had always seen her clearly, even when his vision had been shrouded in darkness. He traced the lines of her face with fingertips that had memorized her features long before his sight returned, and he spoke of how he had fallen in love with the curve of her smile through the warmth in her voice, how he had known the kindness in her eyes through the gentleness of her words, how he had mapped the geography of her soul through countless midnight conversations and found it more beautiful than any landscape his restored vision could reveal. Eleanor wept then, tears of joy and release, and the profound relief of finally being seen and accepted and cherished. And Frederick kissed each tear from her cheeks with a tenderness that made her heart ache with gratitude for the improbable series of events that had brought them together in that Gothic library on an autumn night when she had believed herself destined for permanent invisibility. Their union that night was a conversation continued from all those hours in the library, a physical expression of the intellectual and emotional intimacy they had cultivated in darkness. And Eleanor discovered that being truly known was far more intoxicating than any passion she had imagined in her lonely years of resigned spinsterhood. When dawn broke over Ravenscroft Hall on December 15, 1814, the Duke and Duchess lay entwined in sheets of finest Egyptian cotton, and Frederick watched the winter light play across his wife's sleeping face with an expression of such profound contentment that Mrs. Fleming, who had quietly opened the curtains, retreated with tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Eleanor stirred to find her husband gazing at her with those healed eyes that had wept with joy upon first seeing her face, and she no longer flinched from his scrutiny, because she had finally accepted what he had known all along: that beauty was never about symmetry or fashion or the arbitrary standards society imposed upon women, but about the courage to offer one's true self to another, and the grace to receive such an offering with wonder and gratitude. They breakfasted together in the small morning room, a departure from ducal tradition that Frederick insisted upon because he could not bear to be separated from her even for the formal rituals of household management, and the servants whispered among themselves that they had never seen the Duke so happy, that the bitter recluse who had retreated from life after his accident had been transformed by the plain spinster companion whose voice had called him back from despair, and that Ravenscroft Hall itself seemed to have awakened from a long slumber, its ancient stones warming with the joy that radiated from the newlywed Duke and his unlikely Duchess, who had proven that love could indeed flourish in the most unexpected gardens when two hearts were brave enough to recognize each other beyond the superficial judgments that the world held so tragically dear.